The night air was thick and still, smelling of parched earth and the faint chemical tang of chlorine. Liam sat on the edge of the chaise lounge, the sleek metal cool against his bare legs, and stared into the dark mirror of his swimming pool. It wasn't just a pool, it was a monument, an infinity-edge, black-bottomed vessel of quiet grief that he and Sarah had designed together. Every tile, every jet, every soft, color-changing LED was a memory. Now, 2 years after she was gone, it was mostly just a quiet, deep void reflecting a sky with too few stars. A low, unfamiliar hum vibrated through the flagstone patio, a discordant note in the familiar symphony of late summer cicadas. Liam frowned. It wasn't the pool filter. That was on a daytime timer. It wasn't the air conditioner. That was a higher-pitched whine. This was a guttural, laborious drone, a sound of effort. He stood, his lean frame tensing. In the 2 years he'd been living in this suffocatingly quiet, upscale neighborhood, the only unexpected noise had been the occasional coyote yelp from the preserve behind the house. He walked to the edge of the patio, his bare feet silent on the stone. The sound was coming from the far side of the pool, near the 6-foot privacy fence that separated his property from Carol's. Carol, the neighborhood's self-appointed queen of curb appeal and passive-aggressive notes, a woman whose prize-winning hydrangeas seemed to be the sole source of her validation. Liam's eyes scanned the manicured perimeter. The landscape lighting cast long, dancing shadows from the boxwoods and Japanese maples. And then he saw it. A thick black hose snaking over the top of the fence like a python, its end disappearing into the dark water of his pool. For a moment, his mind refused to process the image. It was too absurd, too brazen. He followed the hose with his eyes back to the fence line, where the humming was loudest. Peering through the slats, he could just make out a flicker of movement in the shadows of his neighbor's yard. A cold, sharp anger, an emotion he hadn't truly felt since the hospital, pricked at his numbness. He walked briskly along the edge of the pool, the sound of the pump growing louder, a greedy, sucking noise. He rounded the waterfall feature and stopped dead. There, standing on a small step stool she'd brought from her side, was Carol. She was 50-something, dressed in pristine white capris and a pink polo shirt, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed even in the humid night. She was leaning over the fence, her face a mask of intense concentration, fiddling with the hose. A bright yellow submersible pump was submerged a few feet from the edge, its power cord trailing back over the fence with the hose. She was draining his pool. "Carol!" She jumped, spinning around with a startled gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, her perfectly manicured nails a flash of coral in the dim light. "Liam! My goodness, you scared the life out of me!" Her voice was a practiced blend of surprise and manufactured sweetness. "What are you doing?" Liam asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, this?" She gestured vaguely at the industrial-grade theft happening in his backyard. "It's just, well, with the drought and the water restrictions, you know. My poor petunias are simply withering away. It's a tragedy." Liam stared at her, then at the hose, then back at her. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was breathtaking. "You're stealing my water." Carol bristled, her sweet facade cracking. "I wouldn't call it stealing. Heavens, no! You're not using it. It just sits here, evaporating. It's a terrible waste, Liam. I'm repurposing it, putting it to good use." "The town said emergency water use only, Carol, not drain your neighbor's pool for your petunias." "Don't be so dramatic," she scoffed, turning back to adjust the hose. "I'm not taking all of it. Just a few 100 gallons. You'll never even miss it." The humming pump was a physical manifestation of her entitlement, sucking away the one piece of his life that still felt connected to Sarah. The water level, which he subconsciously tracked with architectural precision every single day, was already visibly lower, the dark water line on the black tile stark and accusing. "Turn it off," he said. the words coming out like chips of ice. "Now, Liam, there's no need to be difficult. Turn it off or I'm calling the police." She laughed, a short, sharp bark that grated on his nerves. "And tell them what? That I'm watering my flowers? They'll laugh you off the phone. Don't be a child." He saw the thick orange extension cord running from the pump across the fence and presumably into an outlet in her yard. But his own yard had outlets too, the ones that powered the landscape lighting and the waterfall. He walked over to the small weatherproof control panel on the side of the house, his jaw tight. He flipped 3 breakers. The landscape lights flickered and died. The waterfall choked into silence, and the humming from the pump stopped. The sudden quiet was profound. In the new darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow from his kitchen window, Carol's silhouette was rigid with fury. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice stripped of all its earlier pretense. "I turned off the power to my yard," Liam said calmly. "You're trespassing. Take your pump and your hose and get off my property." He expected her to argue, to threaten him with homeowners association bylaws. He did not expect what happened next. After a moment of tense silence, she let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine. Be that way." She disappeared from the fence line. Liam stood there, his heart still pounding with adrenaline, waiting for the sound of her back door slamming shut. He bent down to grab the hose, intending to pull it and the pump out of his water. But then a new sound started, a sputtering cough, then a roar. It was a small engine, like a lawnmower, but angrier. Louder, it ripped through the night, a brutal mechanical snarl that made the cicadas fall silent. Liam's blood ran cold. He slowly stood up, looking towards the fence. A moment later, Carol reappeared. In her hands was a small, red, gas-powered pump, the kind contractors use to dewater job sites. A new, even thicker hose was already attached to it. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed with exertion and rage. "You see, Liam," she grunted, wrestling the heavy pump onto the top of the fence, balancing it precariously. "I came prepared for unpleasantness. This was no longer a petty whim. This was premeditated. She had planned this. She had brought a backup, a gas-powered pump in case he cut the electricity. The thought was so sociopathic it momentarily stunned him. "Carol, stop! That's dangerous! You can't put that there!" he yelled, rushing forward. The pump was vibrating violently on the narrow fence top, the engine screaming. She ignored him, grabbing the new hose and preparing to throw it into the water. He reached the edge of the pool just as she did. "Get away from my pool!" he shouted, grabbing the thick-ribbed hose. "Let go of my property!" she shrieked back, pulling on it with surprising strength. They were locked in a ridiculous, terrifying tug-of-war. He pulled, and for a second, he felt the hose slide his way. But she dug in her heels on her step-stool, yanking back hard. The movement was too much for the precariously balanced pump. It wobbled, the engine sputtering as it tilted. "Carol, the pump!" Liam yelled, letting go of the hose to try and steady it. But it was too late. His sudden release of tension on the hose sent her stumbling backward. Her foot slipped off the step-stool. Her eyes went wide with shock as her balance left her completely. For a horrifying, silent moment, she seemed to hang in the air. Then she fell. She didn't fall back into her own yard. Her momentum carried her forward, over the fence. She let out a short, sharp scream as she crashed through the manicured branches of a Japanese maple, and then, with a heavy, sickening splash, she hit the water in the deep end of the pool. Liam stared, frozen in shock. The gas pump, yanked by the hose still clutched in her hand, teetered for a second longer on the fence. Then, with a metallic clang, it tipped over and followed her in. It all happened in less than 3 seconds. The splash echoed. And then, silence. A few ripples disturbed the black surface of the water, spreading out towards the edges. The roaring engine was gone, choked into silence by the water. "Carol?" Liam called out, his voice hoarse. No answer. He ran to the edge, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Carol, are you okay?" He expected to see her sputtering, coughing, furious, but the surface of the water was still. dark, empty. The pool's black bottom made it impossible to see more than a few feet down, even with the light from the house. And then he saw it. A stream of tiny bubbles breaking the surface, right where she'd gone in. Not the big, frothy bubbles of someone thrashing, but the small, desperate bubbles of trapped air. A cold dread, heavier and more profound than any anger, seized him. She hadn't come back up. He peered into the dark water, his mind racing. Did she hit her head? Was she unconscious? He stripped off his shirt, ready to dive in, his mind already calculating the depth, the search pattern he'd have to use. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw something that made the air freeze in his lungs. A faint, pale shape 8 feet down. It was her. But she wasn't floating up. She was being held down. The black pump hose, the one he'd been fighting her for, was wrapped tight around her ankle. It snaked upwards from the bottom, a dark, taut line. The heavy gas pump, now a 100-pound anchor of cast iron and steel, had followed her to the bottom and pinned the hose, trapping her in the silent, crushing dark. He could see her struggling, a faint, ghostly movement in the deep. Her white capris were a pale smudge against the black plaster. She was alive, There was no time for thought, only a primal reptilian instinct to act. Liam launched himself into a shallow dive. The shock of the cold water a violent slap that jolted his system. The world dissolved into a muted, pressurized roar. He opened his eyes, the chlorine stinging, and kicked hard, propelling himself downward into the suffocating blackness. The 8 feet to the bottom felt like 80. The pressure built in his ears, a painful, insistent popping. Down, down, into the cone of murky light cast from the kitchen window, a world of distorted shadows and dancing sediment kicked up by her fall. He saw her clearly now, a pale, terrifying sculpture of impending death. Her eyes were wide open, staring at him with a horror so pure it transcended their petty conflict. They were no longer the eyes of his shrewish, entitled neighbor. They were the eyes of a terrified animal caught in a trap. Her perfectly coiffed hair floated around her head in a ghostly halo. Her hands were clawing uselessly at the thick black hose cinched around her ankle. Her body, fighting its own buoyancy, was arched in a desperate, silent scream. He reached her just as a final, shuddering gasp escaped her lungs, a large, silver bubble that wobbled its way toward the surface. He grabbed her arm, pulling, but it was like trying to lift a boulder. The hose was anchored tight. He followed it with his hand down to the sandy, black-plastered floor of the pool and felt the cold, unyielding metal of the pump. It was wedged slightly, its sheer weight multiplied by the water. He tried to lift it, his muscles straining, his lungs already beginning to burn. It didn't budge. Not an inch. Her hands found him then, grabbing his arms, his shoulders, with a frantic, inhuman strength. This was the moment lifeguards were warned about, the panicked victim who would drown their rescuer. Her nails dug into his skin, her face contorted, pleading with him, accusing him. He saw the understanding dawning in her eyes. He couldn't move the pump. He couldn't save her. His own body was screaming for air. Black spots danced at the edge of his vision. He had a choice. Stay here and die with her, pulled under by her panic, or go up and try something else. He ripped his arm from her grasp, the scrape of her nails leaving fiery trails on his skin, and pushed off the bottom. He broke the surface with a ragged, desperate gasp, sucking in the thick night air. His chest heaved. For a split second, he just floated, treading water, his mind a chaotic whirl of adrenaline and disbelief. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. A suburban squabble over petunias had turned into a scene from a horror film in his own backyard. He looked down. The stream of bubbles had stopped. No. The word was a choked whisper. Time was gone. There were no minutes left, only seconds. Calling 911 was a death sentence. It would take them 10 minutes just to get here. He was the first responder. The only responder. He couldn't lift the pump. He couldn't untie the hose, so he had to sever it. He needed a knife, a blade, something sharp. His mind raced. Kitchen drawers? Full of flimsy paring knives and dull steak knives. Useless. He needed something stronger, something with teeth. The garage. With a powerful kick, he swam to the side, hauling himself out of the water in a single, fluid motion. He didn't pause to catch his breath. He sprinted across the cold flagstones, leaving a trail of dark, wet footprints. The door to the house was locked. He fumbled with the wet handle, his fingers clumsy and numb. Locked. Of course it was locked. The key. Where was the key? His mind was blank. He never used the key. He always used the garage keypad. He didn't hesitate, changing direction and running along the side of the house, his bare feet slapping against the gravel path. The keypad's faint red glow was a beacon in the dark. He punched in the code, his and Sarah's anniversary, his fingers slipping twice on the wet buttons before the heavy door began to groan and roll upwards. He didn't wait for it to open fully, ducking under the rising door and into the cavernous, orderly space of his garage. It smelled of sawdust, oil, and old paint. His tools, his sanctuary of logic and order, were all neatly arranged on a large pegboard against the far wall. Saws, wrenches, drills, all mocking him with their specificity. Too big, too slow. His eyes scanned frantically. Where? Where? And then he saw it, lying on his workbench next to a half-finished birdhouse he'd started months ago and abandoned. A utility knife. Heavy, silver, with a retractable, razor-sharp blade. He snatched it up, its familiar weight a small comfort in the spiraling chaos, and thumbed the blade out. It clicked into place, a sound of deadly purpose. He sprinted back out, not even bothering with the door. He hurdled a row of Sarah's terracotta pots, one of them tipping and shattering on the concrete, the sound distant and irrelevant. He ran, the cold air burning his raw lungs, the utility knife clutched in his hand like a talisman. He reached the pool's edge and didn't slow down. Diving back into the water, the knife held tight. The scene below had changed. Carol was no longer struggling. She was limp, her body swaying gently with the underwater currents, her arms floating listlessly at her sides. Her face, tilted towards the distant light of the kitchen, was slack and pale. She looked like a drowned doll. A fresh wave of terror and adrenaline surged through him. He kicked harder, closing the distance, fighting the primal urge to scream into the water. He reached her side and immediately went to work on the hose wrapped around her ankle. It was thick, reinforced rubber, designed to withstand pressure and abrasion. It was not designed to be cut underwater by a man with burning lungs and shaking hands. He sawed at it, the blade catching, then slipping. He repositioned, trying to get a better angle. His vision was tunneling, the pressure in his chest becoming an unbearable, crushing weight. He could feel his own consciousness starting to fray at the edges. He gritted his teeth and pulled the knife back for one more desperate attempt. He put all his weight into it, pulling the blade towards himself. It sliced through a layer of rubber, then slid off, the tip dragging hard across the back of his other hand. He felt a searing, electric pain. He looked down and saw a dark cloud erupting from his own flesh, mixing with the water, obscuring his view. Blood. His blood. But he didn't stop. He ignored the pain, the screaming of his lungs, the black spots that now consumed his vision. He found the hose again by touch, located the gash he'd already made, and drove the knife into it, sawing back and forth with the last vestiges of his strength. One strand snapped, then another. He felt the tension in the hose give. With a final convulsive tear, the rubber parted. She was free. He let the knife fall, its silver body spiraling down into the black abyss of the deep end. He wrapped one arm around Carol's chest, his other hand grabbing a fistful of her shirt, and kicked for the surface. She was a dead weight now, heavy and utterly unresponsive. He kicked, his legs burning, his mind fading. He was pulling her up from her grave, fighting against the water that wanted to keep her. They broke the surface together in a chaotic explosion of foam and desperate, ragged breath. Liam coughed, spitting out water, his lungs aching as they drew their first clean breath. He held her head above the water, her face lolling to the side. In the faint light, her skin was a terrifying bluish white. Her lips were gray. He put his ear close to her mouth. There was no breath. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for the carotid artery, his own blood now streaming freely from his hand, turning the water around them a faint pink. For a second, he felt nothing. Then a flutter, thready, weak, fading. a pulse. He held her limp body in the deep end of his pool, the water that she had tried to steal now a potential crime scene. The silence of the night pressed in, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the frantic, failing rhythm of her heart. He had won their stupid war, and in doing so had become her only hope for survival. He was no longer her neighbor. He was her keeper, the unwilling custodian of her life, and the clock was still ticking. The thready pulse was a ticking clock. Panic and purpose fused in Liam's mind. He had to get her out. Now, towing her was like dragging a waterlogged mattress. Her dead weight fought him with every stroke. He hooked an arm under her chin, keeping her head above water, and kicked backwards towards the shallow end. The water swirled around them, pink from his bleeding hand. The silence was absolute, broken only by his own harsh, ragged breaths and the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge. It felt like an eternity, a slow, desperate retreat from the deep end's gaping maw. When his feet finally touched the sloped floor of the shallow end, he nearly collapsed with relief. But the fight wasn't over. He half-dragged, half-carried her up the steps, her limbs clumsy and uncooperative. The final hurdle was the edge of the pool. He gripped her under the arms, braced his feet, and heaved. For a moment, she slipped from his grasp, her wet skin like ice. He got a better grip on the waistband of her capris and pulled again, muscles screaming in protest until she flopped onto the flagstone patio with a wet, heavy slap. She lay there under the pale light from the kitchen, a grotesque parody of a sunbather. Her face was ashen, her lips a deep, bruised purple. Her chest was still, his phone. He needed his phone. He scanned the patio, his eyes darting wildly, on the chaise lounge, where this whole nightmare had started. He sprinted over, grabbed the phone, his wet fingers struggling to unlock it. He swiped to the emergency call screen and hit the numbers, his thumb leaving a bloody smudge on the glass. The call connected on the second ring. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, a surreal counterpoint to the chaos in his head. My neighbor. She fell in my pool, Liam gasped, his voice cracking. He was already moving back toward Carol, phone pressed between his ear and shoulder. She's not breathing. I just pulled her out. Sir, what is your address? He rattled it off, his eyes fixed on Carol's still form. Okay, sir. Help is on the way. Is she conscious? No, unconscious, not breathing. Do you know CPR, sir? Yes, a little. A long time ago. He and Sarah had taken a class at the community center. He remembered her laughing at how serious he was, how he'd pressed too hard on the dummy's chest. The memory was a lightning bolt of pain. I need you to start chest compressions immediately. Can you do that for me? Place the heel of your hand in the center of her chest, right on the breastbone. Liam dropped to his knees beside Carol. The stone was cold and wet. He did as the dispatcher said, placing his hand, then locking the fingers of his other hand over it. The gash on the back of his hand throbbed, dripping blood onto her pink polo shirt. Now I want you to push hard and fast, sir. About 2 inches deep. You're going to count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, he pushed. The first compression felt horrifyingly wrong. He was pressing down on another human being, on the woman who had stood on his fence line, dripping condescension, just minutes ago. Her body was pliant and yet unyielding. Faster, sir. To the rhythm of Staying Alive. Can you do that? He pushed again, harder this time, trying to find the morbid rhythm. Ah, ha, 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 staying alive, staying alive. The disco beat pulsed in his head, a macabre soundtrack to his desperate work. He counted out loud, his voice raw. 10, 11, 12. He could hear the distant rising wail of sirens. They were coming. He just had to keep her heart going until they got here. After 30 compressions, I need you to give her 2 breaths, sir. Tilt her head back, pinch her nose, and breathe into her mouth until you see her chest rise. Liam finished his count and moved to her head. He tilted her chin back, her neck cold and clammy. He took a breath, pinched her nose, and sealed his mouth over hers. The taste was acrid, a vile mix of chlorinated water and something else, something sour from her own lungs. He forced a breath in. Her chest didn't move. He repositioned, tried again, creating a better seal. This time her chest rose slightly. He pulled back, gasping, and delivered a second breath. As he did, a small torrent of water and bile spilled from the corner of her mouth, running down her cheek. Liam recoiled, gagging, but the dispatcher's voice was in his ear, relentless. "Sir, you need to go right back to compressions. Don't stop. 30 more. Count them out." He wiped his mouth with the back of his uninjured hand and repositioned himself over her chest. The sirens were louder now, screaming through the quiet suburban streets. He started pushing again, his body a machine. The world narrowed to the space of her chest, the rhythmic pushing, the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the calm, steady voice in his ear. On the 20-second compression, he heard it. A wet cracking sound. He flinched, his stomach turning. "Sir? Did you hear a crack? That's normal. It might be ribs. Do not stop. You're doing a good job. Keep going." He shut his eyes, trying to block it all out. The sound, the feel of her cold skin, the sight of his blood mingling with the pool water on her shirt. He was no longer Liam the architect. He was a desperate, anonymous force, fighting a losing battle against death in his backyard. The scream of the sirens became a roar, then the rumble of a diesel engine. Flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, strobing across his patio, his house, the black surface of the pool, painting the scene in garish, frantic colors. He heard heavy footsteps, the clang of metal, and then voices. "Right here! We're back here!" he yelled, not missing a beat in his compressions. 2 paramedics in dark blue uniforms vaulted into the yard, a huge red bag and a defibrillator in their hands. A moment later, 2 police officers followed, their faces grim, their hands resting near their belts. "Okay, we've got it." "You can stop!" The paramedic's voice cut through his haze. Liam pulled his hands back as if he'd been burned. He scrambled away, making room, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The paramedics descended on Carol with a practiced, urgent efficiency that seemed both miraculous and terrifying. "No pulse, starting compressions," one shouted, taking over where Liam had left off. "Get the pads on her! Let's push one of epi!" "Bagger! I need suction!" They were a whirlwind of focused energy, of jargon and equipment he didn't understand. They cut open her pink polo shirt, exposing her chest. They placed paddles, shouted, "Clear!" and her body arched unnaturally as the electricity jolted through her. Liam watched, mesmerized and horrified from the edge of the patio. He was on the outside now, a spectator to the life he had dragged back from the brink. He became aware of his own state. He was soaked, shivering, and his hand was throbbing, wrapped in a makeshift bandage of his own t-shirt he didn't remember grabbing. He looked down and saw the utility knife lying on the flagstones near his feet, its blade still extended, glinting in the flashing emergency lights. He'd dropped it when he climbed out of the pool. A shadow fell over him. He looked up into the impassive face of one of the police officers. The man was older, with tired eyes that seemed to have seen everything. His gaze wasn't on Liam, but was scanning the entire scene. He took in the step stool by the fence. The 2 hoses, one neatly coiled, the other sliced and floating limply in the water. He saw the shattered terracotta pot on the side path. His eyes lingered on the bloody utility knife on the ground, then traveled up to Liam's bleeding hand, then finally met his eyes. The officer's expression was unreadable. A mask of professional neutrality that was somehow more chilling than open accusation. All the chaos, the panic, the desperate CPR, it all faded into the background. A new, colder dread began to settle in Liam's gut. The officer took a small notepad from his pocket. He didn't ask if Liam was okay. He didn't offer comfort. His voice was flat, official, and carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. "Sir," he said, his eyes flicking back to the knife. "I'm Officer Miller. Can you tell me exactly what happened here tonight?" The question hung in the strobing red and blue light, heavy and solid. "Can you tell me exactly what happened here tonight?" It wasn't a request for a story. It was a demand for a statement, a record. Liam's mind was a slick, chaotic surface where facts struggled for purchase. She fell," he stammered, the words feeling flimsy and inadequate. He gestured vaguely towards the fence. "She was on a step stool. She fell in." Officer Miller's gaze didn't waver. He made a small note on his pad. "She fell in," he repeated, his tone flat. "Was she visiting you, sir?" No, she—" Liam's voice trailed off. How could he explain? "She was here to steal my water with a gas-powered pump after her first electric pump failed because I cut the power to my own yard. It sounded like the ravings of a madman. She was just by the fence. And she was trapped? The officer prompted, his pen poised. You said you had to cut her free. Yes. Liam looked at the limp, severed hose floating in the water. The pump! It fell in with her. The hose got tangled around her leg. It was holding her down. Miller's eyes flicked to the hose, then to the heavy-duty, gas-powered pump he could now see shimmering at the bottom of the deep end, illuminated by the officer's powerful flashlights. That's her pump? Yes, Liam said, then hesitated. I mean, she brought it. It's hers. Why did your neighbor bring a gas-powered water pump into your backyard, sir? The question was quiet, patient, and utterly devastating. It was the question Liam had no logical-sounding answer for. The water restrictions, he began, but his explanation dissolved into a useless mumble. While Miller questioned him, the other, younger officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, began to move with quiet purpose. She produced a camera and began taking pictures, the flash momentarily overwhelming the strobing emergency lights. A flash on the step stool, a flash on the severed hose, a flash on the bloody utility knife on the patio, another on the shattered pot. She then began placing small yellow evidence markers next to each item. Number 1, by the knife. Number 2, by the stool. His home was being cataloged, dissected, turned into a collection of exhibits for a story he was rapidly losing control of. The commotion had finally breached the insulated quiet of the neighborhood. A porch light flickered on next door. Then another. Liam saw figures in bathrobes and pajamas peering through windows and stepping onto their manicured lawns. Mrs. Gable from across the street, a woman whose internal radar for drama was preternaturally acute, was already walking purposefully across her lawn. Her arms clutched around a silk housecoat. Is that Carol's ambulance? She called out, her voice sharp with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. What happened? I heard shouting earlier. Officer Miller held up a hand, a clear signal for her to keep her distance, but her words hung in the air. Shouting. She'd heard them arguing. He had yelled at Carol. He'd told her to get away from his pool. In the context of a woman now fighting for her life, it sounded damning. Just then, a distraught-looking man in an ill-fitting golf shirt and shorts stumbled into the yard. It was Gary, Carol's husband. He was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and fear as he took in the scene. The ambulance, the police, the paramedics swarming his wife's inert body. Carol? He whispered, then louder. Carol! What's going on? The female officer intercepted him gently but firmly. Sir, you need to stay back. Let the paramedics work. Is she okay? What happened? Gary pleaded, his eyes scanning the yard until they landed on Liam. Liam was standing there, soaked, bloody, being questioned by a police officer. Gary's confusion curdled instantly into accusation. You! He snarled, pointing a trembling finger. What did you do? Sir, Officer Miller said, stepping between them. We're trying to figure that out. The lead paramedic shouted something then, his voice cutting through the noise. We got a rhythm back. It's thready, but it's there. Let's move now! The team moved with renewed urgency, loading Carol's body onto a gurney, a web of tubes and wires now connecting her to a symphony of beeping machines. As they wheeled her past, Liam saw her face. It was slack, her mouth slightly open, an oxygen mask covering her nose. She looked like a stranger. He felt a dizzying wave of nausea. He had done this. He had saved her, but he had also somehow caused this. They loaded her into the back of the ambulance. Gary tried to climb in after her, but a paramedic stopped him. You can follow us to the hospital, sir, St. Mary's. We need the room to work. The ambulance doors slammed shut, a sound of grim finality. The sirens, silent until now, erupted with a deafening wail, and the vehicle pulled away, its lights painting a frantic, fading path down the street. The silence that descended in its wake was heavier, more charged than before. The immediate life-or-death crisis was over. The investigation was just beginning. Officer Miller turned back to Liam. His demeanor had subtly shifted. The pretense of a simple fact-finding conversation was gone. He looked at the evidence markers, at Gary, who was now sobbing quietly while being questioned by the other officer, and then back at Liam. "Sir, you said you heard a shout earlier?" Miller asked Mrs. Gable, who had crept closer. "Oh, yes," she said, her eyes wide. A man's voice, angry, and then Carol, then a big splash. "I thought it was just kids." Miller nodded slowly, his gaze locking back onto Liam. He saw the cut hand, the discarded knife, the angry neighbor, the incoherent explanation. He saw a story, and it wasn't one of a simple accident. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth, using Liam's last name for the first time. "I need you to listen to me carefully." He reached to his belt and unclipped his radio, speaking into it briefly. Then he turned back, his face set like stone. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, the words hitting Liam like physical blows. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The familiar words, heard 1,000 times in movies and television shows, were utterly alien and terrifying when spoken to him in his own backyard, next to the pool he had built with his wife. The second officer, Davis, approached, a pair of handcuffs glinting in her hand. "Sir, please put your hands behind your back," she said, her voice polite but firm. Liam stared at her, then at Miller, his mind unable to bridge the gap between pulling a woman from the jaws of death and this. He was the one who performed CPR. He was the one who dove into the dark. He was the hero of this story, wasn't he? But as the cold steel clicked shut around his wrists, the metal biting into the skin next to his raw, bleeding wound, he understood. As they led him away from his home, past a sobbing, hate-filled Gary, and towards a patrol car now parked at his curb, he saw the yellow police tape being unrolled, cordoning off his life. He hadn't been the hero. In the eyes of the law, he was just the last man standing at the scene of a crime. The interrogation room was a sterile gray box, smelling faintly of bleach and stale coffee. The cold steel of the handcuffs had been replaced by the cold silence of the room. Liam sat on a hard plastic chair, the tremors of adrenaline having subsided into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He'd said nothing since they'd put him in the car, the two words his mind kept replaying on a loop. Get a lawyer. When she finally arrived, she was not what he expected. Her name was Helen Pierce, a public defender with tired eyes that held a surprising fire. She listened, her expression unreadable, as Liam recounted the entire night's events, from the first hum of the pump to the click of the handcuffs. He left nothing out: the argument, his anger, the gas-powered pump, the ridiculous tug-of-war. The truth felt even more absurd spoken aloud in the fluorescent hum of the police station. When he finished, Helen leaned back, tapping a pen on her legal pad. "Okay," she said, her voice raspy. "So, to recap, your neighbor, a woman with whom you had an ongoing dispute, trespassed onto your property to steal water using not one but 2 pumps. In a struggle over her equipment, she fell into your pool, was trapped by the very pump she was using, and you dove in and saved her life with a utility knife you just happened to have handy." "Yes," Liam said, his voice hollow. "That's what happened. Mr. Thompson," she said, leaning forward, her gaze intense. "It's not what happened that matters. It's what a prosecutor can make a jury believe happened. And what they'll believe is this: you're a reclusive widower who got into a shouting match with your neighbor. There was a struggle. She ended up at the bottom of your pool with an injury, and you were found standing over her with a knife." She gestured to the two-way mirror on the wall. "Right now, you're not the hero of this story. You're the villain." The next few weeks were a blur of legal purgatory. Liam was released on bail, returning to a home that no longer felt like his. Yellow police tape still sagged across his driveway. His pool, his beautiful, black-bottomed monument to Sarah, was now a murky, leaf-strewn pit, the water level lowered by the police divers who had retrieved the pump, the hose, and his utility knife. Helen's grim prediction proved prophetic. The district attorney was painting a simple, brutal picture. Carol, still in a medically induced coma at St. Mary's, was the sympathetic victim. Her husband, Gary, gave tearful interviews to local news, speaking of Carol's fear of her unstable and aggressive neighbor. Mrs. Gable's testimony about the shouting provided the conflict. Liam's reclusiveness provided the sinister character profile. The charges were formally filed: aggravated assault and attempted manslaughter. Liam sat in Helen's cramped office, staring at the evidence photos she'd been given. A picture of the sliced hose, a picture of the blood-stained utility knife on the patio, a picture of his own lacerated hand. It was a mosaic of his guilt. "They're offering a plea deal," Helen said, sliding a document across her desk. "Plead guilty to assault with a deadly weapon, they'll drop the attempted manslaughter. You'll serve 5 to 7 years. Liam stared at her, his blood running cold. 5 years? For saving her life? For being unable to prove it, she corrected him gently. It's your word against a woman in a coma and a mountain of circumstantial evidence. No, Liam said, shaking his head, a spark of the old anger returning. No, I won't do it. He looked at the pictures again, his architect's mind finally pushing through the fog of trauma, looking for a flaw in the design, a detail that didn't fit. It was all there, the whole damning story, except for one thing. He pointed at the photo of the red, gas-powered pump lying on a blue police tarp. That, he said, his voice gaining strength. That's the key. Why was it there? Their story doesn't explain that. A simple argument doesn't end with a 100-pound industrial water pump at the bottom of a pool. Helen's eyes lit up with that familiar fire. Exactly. We need to prove she brought it. We need to prove her intent. Their investigation was a race against the clock. They subpoenaed Carol's credit card statements and bank records. They found the purchase of the electric pump at a local big-box store 2 months prior. But the gas pump, the one that had nearly been her tombstone, was nowhere. No purchase, no record. It was a dead end. The trial date was set. Liam felt the walls closing in. He began to believe he would go to prison, that the final chapter of his life would be a story of a crime he didn't commit. The breakthrough came from the most mundane of places. Helen's paralegal, a young dogged kid named Marco, was tasked with calling every equipment rental shop within a 50-mile radius. For 2 days, he got nothing. Then on the 3rd day, he got a hit, a small, family-owned place called Rent-A-Tool, 30 miles away. The owner remembered a woman, very well-dressed and very determined, renting a gas-powered dewatering pump. He said she paid in cash. He has security footage, Helen said to Liam over the phone, her voice tight with excitement for the first time. We've got a court order. Marco is on his way to get it now. They watched the footage on Helen's laptop in her office. The timestamp in the corner read 3:14 p.m. on the day of the incident. There, in grainy black and white, was Carol. She was wearing the same pink polo shirt and white capri she'd had on when she fell. The footage showed her signing the rental agreement, counting out the cash, and then arguing with the owner as he explained how to start the heavy machine. The final shot was of her in the parking lot, struggling and failing to lift the red pump into the trunk of her Mercedes. A store employee had to help her. It was the whole story. The premeditation, the intent, the lie at the heart of the prosecution's case, all laid bare in a silent, grainy video. The charges were dropped the next day. The DA's office issued a terse, one-sentence press release citing new evidence that has come to light. There was no apology. Gary stopped giving interviews. The police tape came down. Liam was free. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were falling. Liam stood on his patio, staring at the pool. It was clean now, the water a perfect dark mirror. But he no longer saw Sarah's memory in its reflection. He saw Carol's wide, terrified eyes. He saw the cloud of his own blood in the water. He saw the flashing lights of the ambulance. A certified letter had arrived that morning. It was from Gary's lawyer. Carol had woken from the coma 2 months ago. The prolonged oxygen deprivation had caused a severe anoxic brain injury. She could walk and speak, but her memory was a blank slate, resetting every few minutes. She would need institutional care for the rest of her life. The letter was a formal notice that, due to catastrophic medical debt, Gary was selling their house. Liam walked to the fence line. The prize-winning hydrangeas in Carol's yard were brown and withered, their dead heads drooping on brittle stalks. The battle for survival had claimed more than one victim. Carol had survived, but her life was gone. Gary had lost his wife and his home. Liam looked back at the pool one last time. He had won. He had survived. But his sanctuary was gone. replaced by a tomb of traumatic memories. He pulled out his phone not to call a lawyer, but a contractor. "Yes," he said into the phone, his voice steady and clear. "I'd like to get an estimate. I want to have my pool filled in." He was burying the past, all of it. He was choosing to build something new on the foundations of his grief and his survival. It wasn't justice and it wasn't karma. It was just the end of the war.